In this module, we're going to cover how do you migrate your legacy policy settings from your pre-existing policies. The module goals of what we're going to learn is first we're going to explain the purpose of the migration assistant. Then we're going to look at the situations where we'll do the manual or the automatic migration. We'll identify the steps to do a manual, and we'll identify the steps to the automatic migrations, and then we'll look at our different policy settings that we want to migrate. So in the migration overview, the whole idea is that we're going to upgrade any of our legacy products to our new ENS product and get all the settings and also the assignments if you want to. The thing about it is, if you'll recall, you do have to add this extension separately. Okay, you'll have a little wizard and it will support both automatic and manual migration. In the overview of the settings that will migrate, the product for VirusScan Enterprise 8.8, it will upgrade all the policies and client tasks. For host intrusion prevention Firewall, it will migrate over the host IPS catalog, but now it will be called the Firewall catalog. It will also migrate over all your firewall policies and any of the general policies. For host intrusion prevention, it will now have the IPS rules policy, and it will have any excluded application protection rules. It will have all of your IPS exceptions. It will migrate over your custom signatures. It will also migrate over any McAfee defined signatures that are supported by our exploit prevention policy, and it will also migrate over the IPS protection policy. For SiteAdvisor Enterprise 3.5, it will migrate over the policies and the client tasks. But do remember this, you must have those products be to the supported versions before you do the migration. So I would double check what are your current version of your extensions for those products, install the latest extension for these listed products, and then you can do your migration. In the settings that migrate that has to do with your Macs and Linux, the McAfee Endpoint Protection for Mac policies and client tasks are migrated over. Also the VirusScan for Mac policies and client tasks are migrated. For the McAfee Host Intrusion Prevention, you will receive the IPS rules policy just like you did for the Windows version, where you'll have everything having to do with your application protection rules, your exceptions, your custom signatures, any of the McAfee defined signatures, and your IPS protection policy. One thing I want to point out is the McAfee ENS for Mac settings will take precedence over the McAfee VSE for Linux settings. For what migrates for your exception rules, the source exception that we have listed, if it's executables, caller modules, and API, the type of signature that it was is any of the McAfee defined that you had, like buffer overflow, illegal API usage signatures. Where it will show up is in the exploit protection feature, and the target setting will be in the exclusions. Any of the executables and parameters, if they were for the registry signatures, they will show up in your access protection, and you will see it under the executables and subrule parameters. Any executables that have nothing to do with signatures, they will show up in your access protection, the part of the exploit protection. And the target setting will be global exclusions. Any grep exceptions, the signature type was the fact that the reaction signature ID was the 6052. It will be in the exploit protection, and it will be a part of the enable general privilege escalation prevention. When you do the automatic migration, it will automatically name the policies in the policy catalog. You'll have if it's a one-to-one policy, it will be the same as the source name. If you have a one-to-multiple or multiple-to-one, you can type your own name, but otherwise what it will do is it will automatically name it like migrated VSE policy, and it'll have a number at the end of it. You'll see where it says -1, -2, and so you might want to go in after the fact and rename these policies. A checklist for preparing for the migration. Be sure you use the Endpoint Upgrade Assistant to ensure your endpoints are ready for your deployment. You add the Migration Assistant extension on your EPO server. Review and revise any of your policies that you already have that you want to migrate. Delete any of the ones that you don't want. Consolidate any of your duplicates. Check your wildcard syntax. Then verify the assignments, because if you utilize the automatic migration, only policies and client tasks that are assigned to a group or a managed system will be migrated. Any policies that are not assigned, any tasks that are not assigned, will not be migrated. Be sure you notify everyone that that they are not to make any changes in the policy catalog or client task catalog or host IPS catalog, because you're doing the migration. And once again, be sure that your Microsoft SQL Server has the compatibility level for the current database to be SQL 2008. Your first step is that you install the Endpoint Migration Assistant extension. You will see that there are two extensions. One that's the actual Endpoint Migration Assistant extension, and then you'll have a help extension. As a reminder, remember these are not a part of the ENS bundle, so you do have to add them to your EPO server. I can use the software manager or I can manually add them. And these are not deployed to your client endpoints. So the workflow for migrating the settings automatically is you can select the system or the whole tree or a specific group. You select which products that you want to be migrated. You'll notice if it's Mac or Linux, and then I select those. If I want to migrate the VirusScan Enterprise, I can select Workstation, Server, or both. Review my policies, save the policies, and then deploy the ENS product to my clients. Make sure that they get their new policies. The workflow for the migrating settings manually. What I'll do is you'll select, is it policies, client tasks, or the catalog. You'll select which policies you want to migrate. If I'm migrating VirusScan Enterprise, you can select, is it Workstation, Server, or both. Then I can look at what is the endpoint security policy mapping. It is very recommended that you look at this, so you can see which particular feature of the ENS policies is this product going to go to. Review and edit them. Save it, and then deploy ENS to your client endpoints. In this demonstration, we're going to show you how to migrate the VirusScan Enterprise policies. The first step is I select which is the mode. In this one, I'm selecting manual, or I could have selected automatic. You select what are the objects that I want to migrate. You'll notice we have host IPS, policies, and client tasks. Then I click the next button. In this section, you'll look at the policy mapping so that I can select which VirusScan policies and which host intrusion prevention policies that I want to combine to have one or more different types of policies that has to do with the ENS. So the beauty of this is there's certain features that exist in all these different products that are all going to go into possibly one policy. You'll see what migrated policies will be migrated over and be located in what ENS policies. This little table should show you the mapping for the VirusScan Enterprise policies. You have the list of the pre-existing VirusScan Enterprise policies and where they're going to end up over when you have the endpoint security threat prevention policy. So for example, all your buffer overflow protection is going to go over to the exploit prevention. But if you'll notice, my on-access default processes, my on-access general, my on-access high-risk, and low-risk processes are all going to go and be migrated over into one on-access scan policy. More VirusScan policy mappings that you'll see. We have the high-risk, the low-risk, the general, the default processes, the unwanted programs, the quarantine manager. You'll also see the endpoint protection for Mac policies and VirusScan Enterprise for Linux, and where they actually migrate over into the endpoint security threat prevention policies. In this section on selecting the policies to migrate, if you'll notice, we can select at the top, is it Workstation Server or the Workstation End Server. I select the unwanted programs policy, and I have a custom PUP policy that I've selected, and I also have my quarantine manager policy. So you select which policy from the drop down that I want to use. So one of the things I would say before you get into the planning of this is you need to really think about what are all the different policies that are actually going to be selected to combine one or more policies in ENS. In the next section, I can review where it's going to show up in the policy. I can actually review it and edit it as needed. So if I actually see something that's different than what I really want, I can actually edit it in this part of the policy at this time. I have a summary page that I can view what is actually going to be in the end results. After I click save, then what happens is a server task will run in the background and it'll save the policy in the policy catalog. You don't have to do anything to configure the task. It runs automatically the minute you click save. But if you want to, you can go over to the automation server task log and you can see it running in real time. After it's done, it will ask you, do you want to migrate another policy? You can select no. It might be a good idea. First I would select no and make sure that the other migration has finished before I started another one. So our guidelines and best practices for migrating the McAfee VirusScan Enterprise is for the access protection, look at your port blocking rules and user added exclusions. Those will not migrate. So the idea is what we did is we want our customers to start using the ENS firewall instead of migrating. A good example of a pre-existing access protection rule that exists in VirusScan was the fact that we had a port blocking rule that didn't allow any client to email out SMTP from the machine unless it was a valid email client. That rule doesn't exist anymore because the concept is that you should use the firewall to prevent a product from using SMTP email out unless it is the correct client product. The buffer overflow protection is now renamed exploit protection, and it's set to standard protection by default. You will see that later on. If I have different operating systems, if I have similar products that have different operating systems, you can actually select this create multi-platform policy, so I can create one shared policy for the on-access scan policy. Otherwise, I'm going to have to disable that and to create 3 different policies out there. Any of your exclusions, note the exclusions have to be for root level folders. Review the syntax for those because make sure that it is supported. Your on-access scan settings from your supported Mac and Linux products, you can migrate those to the ENS threat prevention and they can be multi or single platform. The quarantine folder, if the path is longer than 190 characters, it will actually revert it to the default where it's system drive and quarantine. Self-protection is enabled by default regardless of what you did for your legacy settings. In these next slides, we're going to demonstrate how to do the migration of the host IPS catalog manually. Before this version of ENS, the only way that you can migrate the host IPS catalog is it had to be the automatic migration. Again, the first step is I select what is the mode and what is the object that I'm going to migrate. In this scenario, I'm going to select host IPS catalog, and I'm using the manual migration. And then I'll click the next button. You click the save to migrate the host intrusion prevention IPS catalog to now the ENS firewall catalog, and once again your server task will run in the background once you click the save button. In this demonstration, we're going to migrate the host intrusion prevention firewall options. Once again, you select your mode and what objects you want to migrate. Is it the policies or the client tasks? In this section we're selecting policies. The next step is to view your policy map. So once again, this is where I would select what are the firewall options and the firewall rules policies that I actually want to migrate. To view the policy mapping for host intrusion prevention firewall and the general policies, as you see here, in the host intrusion prevention, all the firewall rules, once again, they map directly to the rules policy. The firewall options and the DNS blocking are all going to be now migrated over to the options policy. When we get to the host intrusion prevention general policies, the trusted applications, the and the trusted networks and the client UI will all be migrated over to the options policy, whereas the trusted applications goes over to the access protection. And once again, there's some features of the client UI that it's migrated over to the options policy of the endpoint security common policy. In this screen, we're showing you we've selected the different firewall policies. So I have the options policy. I can select my DNS, the trusted applications, trusted networks, client UI, and then I'll click next. I will review the options policy, and then I can go in and change the name. I can enter in any notes, change any settings at this time, and then click next. We then review what our settings are going to be and click save to finish, and again the server task will automatically run. After you finish, you'll see that it will ask you again, migrate another policy. You can click yes or no. Okay? If you want to migrate the host IPS catalog, in this scenario we're going to click yes. In this demonstration we're going to show you how to migrate the IPS policies. So in the host intrusion prevention, if you'll notice, we have a custom IPS protection and custom IPS rules policy. We're going to migrate these policies over. As before, we're going to select what is our migration mode. We're going to select manual, and then we're going to select policies, and then we're going to click next. On the view policy map, once again we'll select which policies that we would select for this, and then do the mapping to the different policies that has to do with our hosted IPS. For the access protection and buffer overflow policy mapping, you'll see on here parts of the VirusScan Enterprise access protection. Some of it will be mapped over to the common options, and some will be mapped over to the threat prevention access protection. For the host IPS, for the IPS protection, if you'll notice, not only does it map over to the threat prevention for the access protection, you'll also have the exploit prevention. The IPS rules, same thing. It maps over to both the access protection and exploit prevention. The trusted applications, you'll have where it maps over to the access protection. And then the buffer overflow protection of VirusScan maps over to the exploit prevention. And notice the dash is for the auto migration only. In the left pane of the select policies to migrate, you'll select the different options that you want for the different types of policies. For example, this one has the IPS rules, and then we have the access protection rules and buffer overflow policies. Then in the right pane, you can click the drop down and select which custom policy that you have created, or none if you just want to use the default ENS settings, and then you click next. In the next screen, be sure to review all of the settings that you chose for the threat prevention, exploit prevention policies. You can make any changes. An example is that you can change the name and then the notes and anything else that may be available. Then you click next to continue to the next screen. The next screen will pop up for the next custom policy. You can do the same things, such as change the names, make any other changes that applies to this policy, and click next to continue. On the summary screen, be sure to review all your different options that you've selected, and if you're happy with those options, then you click the save, and then the server will do the task to finish the migration at that point. Once again, when it's finished, it'll pop up and it'll ask you, do you want to migrate another policy? You can select yes or no. In this example, we're selecting no, and we'll exit out of this screen. Some guidelines and best practices for migrating the McAfee HIPS policies are: we really recommend that you migrate the host IPS catalog before you migrate the firewall policies. For any of the application protection rules that has to do with the IPS rules policies of HIPS, any user-defined application protection rules for included processes that you had defined will not migrate. The firewall rules and trusted networks, all the traffic is allowed if you have a defined network labeled as trusted in the firewall options policy. If you want to add any more addresses, you need to add those if you want those to be trusted networks. All the IPS signatures, what happens with those is if you had any custom policies where you set the severity reaction to be different, it will merge with what your reaction policy was to determine whether or not you blocked or are reporting that particular signature. Any of the IPS custom signatures that you had before, all of those, and they start with 4001 and go all the way up to 6000, they will migrate now to the ENS access protection custom rules. In the new ENS signatures, you cannot create any custom signatures within the signatures. If you want to create any custom signatures, you have to do that in the access protection rules. For the Site Advisor migration, this screen here shows you the different mappings of the policies that you had before with Site Advisor and what they map to now with the new web control policies. If you'll notice, the enforcement messaging is the same, but all of your different lists, like your authorized list, prohibit list, they will be in the block and allow list, but you also have part of the authorized list in your options policy. The hardening gets sent to two different policies, the browser control and the options. You'll know that the content actions, also you have some features there that will go into content actions and some features that will go into the options. And the same thing with the rating actions. The enable or disable, event tracking, those two only go to the options, whereas the general, you have some features that will go to the options policy and some of them that will go to the endpoint security options policy. The guidelines and best practices for the Site Advisor migration. If you had any multiple instance client tasks, each instance of the Send Web Reporter client task will actually migrate now to a separate instance. And the same thing with the multiple instance policies. You have content actions, authorized list, and prohibit list policies. They will migrate to a separate instance. If you have any source instance that is unedited in the My Default or the McAfee default, the ENS McAfee default will be the one that will be used. The authorized list and the prohibit list that you had in the Site Advisor, they will migrate to the web control block and allow list policies. What will happen is the first instance of an authorized list and prohibit list will migrate to the first instance of the target policy. If you have multiple instances of the source policies, they will migrate to successive instances of the target policies. If you have one source policy that has more instances than another, only those instances will continue to migrate to the new instances of the target policy. A few of the post-migration activities and considerations that we want you to remember is be sure that you review and edit the policies and the related settings after you have migrated these policies. Don't assume that all the changes that were migrated are exactly what you need. We do have a policy comparison tool that exists in EPO that you can use to analyze the two policies. Be sure to compare multiple instances of the same policy. An example are the on-access scan policies. We can also use that to look at the two policies by using that policy comparison tool. After you have everything done, make sure you have the policies assigned correctly, then deploy the client endpoints, make sure that they were successfully installed, make sure they're getting the correct policies and they're being enforced. And if you still have any legacy products or policies that you still need to use, be sure not to remove VirusScan or any of your other pre-existing products such as the host intrusion prevention before you actually remove those policies from EPO. And monitor and tune your policies as necessary. And to check your understanding, true or false. When migrating the VirusScan policies, you must specify to migrate either workstation settings or server settings or both. The default is server. Is that true or is that false? If you selected false, you are correct. The settings actually default to workstation. You have to make the change that you want server or workstation or both. Check your understanding, true or false. An automatic migration is intended for organizations with less than 250 managed systems. Is this true or is this false? If you selected true, that is correct. If you recall, we mentioned before that that is the recommended amount for doing the automatic migration. The key points to review from this module is, first, the automatic migration is intended for organizations with less than 250, whereas the manual is intended for the more than 250. If you have the threat prevention and you want to have your exclusions, they require an absolute path for the root level exclusions. When I'm migrating FireScan policies, do you want workstation, server, or both? The default is workstation. The migration assistant helps you to adjust the migrated settings in your target policies so that you can address the differences between the legacy product and the new product.